I don't know about you, but worrying comes naturally to me. Anxiety often becomes so pervasive in my life that I forget who I am and whom to I belong. Jesus says, don't worry about your clothes or your food. These are mostly not real anxieties for me. I think he was trying to say, don't worry about the superficial, or don't worry about your image. I'm sure he was not talking about my outfits or fashion, right? I love those things. But still, I do have some deeper and some real anxieties. What it means to be a female clergy, especially in this season. What my vocation has meant for me, the sacrifice, and what it has meant for my family or even my children. How social media has changed my kids' brains, and I worry about them making meaning in a world that can be so chaotic. And I worry about the impact of all of this has had on their lives. Those are just a few of the anxieties. I told Megan Campion this week that I was going to preach a sermon on anxiety, but I said, don't worry, I'm actually an expert. We are in a season of anxiety. And I know that some of us are worried about Plymouth. Sometimes we feel powerless in the face of transition, and that causes anxiety. And I know that asking for money and running a generosity campaign amid the unknown future for the church is less than ideal. And I know the election makes many of us anxious, another big unknowing. For some of us, the anxiety is closer to home. Maybe our health is failing, or our child's marriage is breaking up, or our grandchild is on the less than desirable path. And some of us try to grasp control where we can when the anxiety gets to be too much. Sometimes we exercise a lot, clean our house, or withhold our well-earned resources. Some of us eat a pint of ice cream every evening, Roger. Or wallow in binge TV, Marta. Perhaps we don't return to church until there is a knowing. I was told early on that when we are anxious, we should simply get information, investigate, and be curious and wonder. And yet we worry when the information does not come fast enough, or we simply can't get to the root of the matter. We long for control and power and authority to manage the situation. It's simply more comfortable and less complicated. Life is messy, and there's no way around it. And when it's messy, it's natural to worry. This morning we hear Jesus' calming voice in the midst of worry. Jesus spoke words of love and care when the lives of the ancient people were anxious like we are. Jesus' words speak a different voice into the mix. He assures us everything is taken care of and reminds us God has mastered the ecosystem in a way that tends to the anxiety we might feel. In the Common English Bible, the birds are fed and the lilies in the field are growing beautifully. In the Message version, people should trust God's care, and not worry about food or clothing. Jesus says, trust God, appreciate God's care, and don't be anxious. In other words, when it's messy, look for God in the midst of all of it. I heard a football reference this week in a random movie I watched, probably because, I was numbing my anxiety. I am not into football, but it's football season, and I know many of you love the game. I don't even really understand the rules or the positions or even the hype, so bear with me on this one. But I like stories. And the story is about a former quarterback, Owen, and an author, Catherine, on a retreat in Morocco. Both of their lives fall apart in various ways. And Owen, the quarterback, describes a football move. The move is called the swing route. You've seen that movie? I know, isn't that fun? The swing route, as he describes it, is finding hope in a big mess. The swing route is never planned. You're not sure it will work. It usually is decided when the game becomes messy. The quarterback has to trust his gut. He has to determine whether in the moment he will release the ball toward the sideline and then slightly arcing upfield. Look, I have no idea what I'm talking about. Slightly arcing upfield to look for a short pass. The quarterback does this by trusting his gut, AKA God. And it becomes a moment where there is hope in a big mess. The swing route works only if the quarterback and his teammates know and trust each other. Trusting your personal gut, God, and your teammate, church. The game becomes a metaphor for community. When it gets messy, remember, we have community to lean on. This week, I listened to an episode of the Ezra Klein Show podcast titled Tired, Distracted, Burned Out. The title should have been, Are You Anxious About Everything in the World? Learn How to Chill by Listening. Ezra is a New York Times columnist and journalist who also hosts a podcast. For this show, he had an author on, Gloria Mark, a professor of the University of California, Irvine, and the author of the book, Attention Span. The book is about ways to pay attention by restoring balance, happiness, and productivity. Are you all paying attention? We know attention spans are declining with the advent of email and smartphones and even Zoom meetings. I would also say television. Studies show that the average attention span on a screen has decreased to around 47 seconds, meaning people tend to focus on a single screen for only about 47 seconds before switching to something else. This represents a significant decline from previous years where attention spans were longer, often around 2.5 minutes. The author says technology has been designed with the intent to augment our capabilities and help us produce more, but we are also distracted, exhausted in our everyday use of it. The interpretation of technology causes so much stress and anxiety. One more thing that adds to our worry. And so there I was. I was walking with my two dogs to get fresh air on a beautiful Colorado fall day. I was walking in the beauty of outside while attached to a podcast on a smartphone. I was not resting my brain or paying attention to the beauty of the golden trees and the blanket they had created on the sidewalk. It's so pretty, right? I was not paying attention to the congregation of wild geese in the cornfields. I was not paying attention to the quiet gravel road lined with quaint farms. Though I was reminded that we get overloaded, a reminder I desperately needed. And so I discerned. Ezra, the host, said, it's like picking up his 2-year-old child I keep doing it because the child wants and needs to be held, but my arms start to ache and tire, so I stop picking up the child effectively. My arm muscles are sore and worn out. The same thing can happen to our attention span muscles. They get worn out too. When this happens, we need to rest them. And knowing we have shorter attention spans and how technology can cause more stress and anxiety, being mindful or intentional about what and who we give our attention to becomes even more vital for our own well-being and the communities we are a part of. Some of you know I deleted my social media apps from my phone several months ago. And this week, I also made some intentional and thoughtful choices in my calendar of to-dos. I decided to step away from some wider church responsibilities. In some ways, I get too distracted to show up wholeheartedly. The complexities of my role and my responsibilities in my family life dominated my ability to realize the power of attention. In other words, how could I practice mindfulness more deeply? Maybe our job is not to find control amid the messiness, but to become more mindful, wholehearted, and lean into love, to practice paying attention in a very distracting culture. What choices did you make differently this week? Or what choices may you make differently this coming week? In my various readings this week, some wise words came to me. We must be fully present to love a single thing wholeheartedly. We must be fully awake to receive and respond to its inherent learning. Finding hope in the messy and anxious and out of control sometimes feels impossible, but being mindful and being present to love wholeheartedly is a good way to begin. I have always loved the church, and coming to this place each week to find safety among each other, sitting shoulder to shoulder in those old sacred pews. Can you just absorb the wisdom from last week or the generations before in these pews? My weekly ritual of showing up at church is grounding and brings me extraordinary joy. It takes me away from every possible screen to sit in the ancient practices of prayer and wisdom. A modern master of Buddhism described how the Buddha had encouraged his monks by stating that those who practiced diligently would indeed be enlightened in 7 days or so. And if not 7 days, then in 7 months or 7 years. A young American monk excitedly started his 7 days, only to be lost in his forgetfulness 10 minutes later. Returning to himself, he started his 7 days again, only to become lost once more in mindless thought, perhaps about what he would do after his enlightenment. Again and again, he began his 7 days, and again he lost his continuity and mindfulness. A week later, he was not enlightened. But the practice over and over again was a practice of humility and self-awareness. Most of us never arrive at enlightenment, and so the work is simply to practice our faith and trust in the beautiful and desperately messy ecosystem that God has created. Mindfulness is not about perfection, but rather the practice of showing up wholeheartedly and paying attention to what's right in front of you and trusting your gut and your community Okay, some tricky things are happening at Plymouth right now. We don't know if we will fund our dream budget for 2025. God knows, Bobby, we want our missions to be higher. Or when an interim will arrive, or if some of our closest community members will stay. I know, right? Anxiety sucks. It's the worst. But what I also know is that Plymouth is crazy wonderful. I mean, really. I don't know if it's mindfulness or a swing route or what, but really good ministry is bursting out of this place. And good ministry happens in places where people trust each other and trust God, whose love is inclusive and full of grace. Last week, our administrative assistant, Anne Marie, announced that for the first time, someone had called and asked for a room to be reserved, and the whole building had been scheduled. Right? That's like my dream. Immediately I said, well, if it's a small group, then they can use my office, or what about a small circle in the sanctuary? You know me, I always lean into loaves and fishes. There's always enough, right? And then some of you saw my video story about Queen and New Eyes Village and getting donated hundreds of brand new toys. Your eyes will literally pop out when you walk into the forum room and see these toys. It's so exciting. And it's exhilarating to think of the possibilities. And then, like Bobby said, I met with Arpi this week, the head of Isaac, our immigration resource nonprofit in town, and they are moving their offices to Plymouth. They wanted to do it before the election because they wanted a safe place. They are anxious too. So they made a mindful swing route. They picked us, Plymouth. We are that safe place. And I know today we continue the vital tradition of housing our neighbors in need with Family Housing Network. These are the things that matter. This is why I adjusted my schedule. I let the meaningless distractions wash away, and I wholeheartedly focused on this community's ecosystem with God's everlasting love. I'm not going to end by saying life won't stop being messy, or that worry will one day disappear. But I can say that I believe Plymouth to be a place that allows me to let go of some of that worry and be okay with some of the messiness. Here each week we gather to hear God's sacred stories, to stop and breathe and be reminded of what a community can look like when we lean into God's unconditional love and extravagant welcome. Each week we get to dream of new ways to do a swing route and reclaim some old ways of gathering mindfully. Here we can continue to be rooted and centered in God's never-ending yearning to love each and every one of us. Amen.